Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. $145 billion. That is the just announced Chinese defense budget, an increase of 10.1%. China is an aggressor. China right now is concentrating power, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, along the Indian frontier. China is projecting power by building a fleet and also endorsing space military exercises and building very effective missile force. All of that is part of the 21st century, the rising power. China now has the second largest defense spending on the planet. This will be the focus immediately for Gordon Chang, Forbes.com, my colleague. And we're dealing with China on an evening in which there is turmoil in North Asia. The attack on Mark Lippert, the American ambassador to South Korea, an attack by a knife-wielding man at this point identified as someone with a history of attacking, a previous record. We do not have all the details. The ambassador is recovering after what looks to be a harrowing event in a restaurant very early in the morning in Seoul. There are photographs of him coming out of the restaurant, blood down his shirt front and in his left hand. We turn to the Chinese budget because this is the power of North Asia, the Chinese defense budget, and we're joined by Kazianis, the editor of Real Clear Defense, a senior fellow at the Defense Policy at the Center for the National Interest. Gordon, $145 billion, an increase of 10.1%. Does that brighten some eyes in Asia to say they're coming for us?
Well, it certainly should. Now, of course, John, we don't know what the real budget is, and clearly it's in excess of $145 billion because China doesn't disclose its real budget. It doesn't disclose procurement, doesn't disclose a lot of research and development. But nonetheless, 10.1% increase is well in excess of economic growth. And what this says is that the Chinese military is becoming much more powerful in the political system in Beijing. That's a real worry for the region.
The Chinese military, where a number of generals over these last months have pledged personal loyalty to Xi Jinping, the head of the Communist Party.
And there's been a number of purges of senior flag officers, which means that there's turmoil at the top of the People's Liberation Army, which isn't good news.
Harry, a very good evening to you. I thank you for joining us on the night of the Chinese defense budget. A lot of happy generals and admirals right now. I want to focus this development, this aggressive development in Asia, on the story of the South China Sea and the anecdotes, which are validated by satellites and other sources, that China's building islands. Why would they build islands in the South China Sea? Good evening to you, Harry.
Good evening. Good evening, gentlemen. Well, I think the reason why they're building these islands in the South China Sea is pretty clear. This is part of China's strategy that it's been deploying since, I guess you say, roughly 2005, maybe 2008, to slowly chip away at the international order, specifically in the South China Sea, but also in the East China Sea. I mean, the strategy, if you really think about it, it's quite genius. I mean, China's Machiavellian moves, if you will, really, they're slowly chipping away at this international order. I mean, if you go back, you look at moves at Scarborough Shoal back in 2012 when they basically took that island feature. You look at the rise of China's military might, and as you guys led with in the segment, you know, they're spending now $145 billion on defense. The ADIZ they launched in the East China Sea back about 18 months ago, deploying oil rigs in the South China Sea, right in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, deploying tons of fishing vessels where the Chinese subsidize their fuel and subsidize their GPS. They're all part of this larger strategy to chip away at the international system and really dominate Asia. And now with China building these islands and these island reclamation projects, which IHS Janes and CSIS have come out with all these different satellite images, they're just one more nail in the coffin for the international system in Asia. Now, what they'll be able to do with these islands is quite fascinating. I mean, they're not very large, but they'll be large enough to put air bases, refueling depots, radar stations, missiles. They're not very defensible, but they'll be able to put a lot of military gear on them. And the interesting thing about all these moves is that all of them sort of lead to the same place, which is the slowly chipping away at the international system. It's very, very concerning.
So, Harry, to put this into context, when you talk about chipping away at the international system, what you're talking about is the South China Sea and the East China Sea, under at least the old rules, were international water. And what the Chinese are trying to do is to deny international water and airspace to other countries. So countries around the region, but also to the United States. Because if there's been any consistent American foreign policy over the course of more than 2 centuries, it has been to defend the right of freedom of navigation. And the Chinese are now, as you put it, chipping away at that notion.
Exactly, Gordon. And this is really the real danger, because the global commons or the ocean commons have always been an international waterway that nobody owns. Nobody can draw a line around the ocean and say, this is my territory, this is my land, because all nations around the world have a shared vested interest in making sure bodies of water are something that are protected, because we all use them. They're common space. That's why they're called the global commons. Well, all of these different Chinese actions, for example, we've talked about this on the show before, the 9 or 10-dash line that China's drawn around the South China Sea as its sovereign territory, or whatever they call it these days, it's extremely concerning, because if they're going to develop these island projects and start putting, advanced air assets or naval assets, and they want to try and enforce this at some point, they would have the operational capacity to do so. Now, these islands, they're not very terribly easy, they're not easily defendable. I mean, it would be very easy to sort of take these islands out and wipe them off the map. But the Chinese, of course, are banking on that we're not going to do that. I mean, the United States hasn't responded to any of these moves going back to 2008. So this is part of China's strategy: slowly chip away at the international order and invest in moves that are very hard to counter.
And these islands serve as aircraft carriers. This is a way of solidifying the defenses in what they call the bastion seas, the South China Sea and the East China Sea, so that over time, Harry, it becomes routine to consider that China dominates the region, though no one has agreed to that, though there's been no, what you'd have to say, settlement of the disputes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. It's just going to be fait accompli. Our governments will change. Japan's government will change. So will the Philippines. And the next generation will assume that China's the boss.
Exactly. I mean, the strategy is, like I said before, it's quite genius. China has this strategy of these slow, long-arching sort of moves that are very hard to challenge. I mean, what do you do when a country plops an oil rig off your disputed exclusive economic zone? That's not enough to start a war, but it's enough to create tensions, but never enough to sort of push it to the next level. And China keeps making these moves over and over again. It's very disconcerting.
The budget, I mentioned $145 billion. Gordon says it's much higher than that. This is what they'll print for this. Does this seem into the range of what we expected, Harry, that they will spend more and more on their military, and we're not shocked by this?
I wouldn't be shocked. I mean, I think we see 10% plus increases year over year, and I think it's almost been for the last decade, if not more. But the thing that concerns me more than anything else is it's that $145 billion. It's completely almost focused in just Asia. Now, everybody likes to say, oh, the United States spends $500 billion plus, but we have to keep in mind that spreads through around the globe. So China gets to take this pool of money and focus it in its most important geographic areas that it's trying to focus and get dominance of. That's what's concerning.
And Gordon, will this be regarded as bellicose?
Well, it certainly will be regarded as a worry, and not just of countries on China's border in the South China Sea, also by countries like India and, of course, the United States. Everyone's going to be concerned by these very big increases in defense spending.
Harry Kazianis at Real Clear Defense, Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. I'm John Batchelor.